NetSparker, the developers of desktop and cloud-based web application security scanners that enable you to automatically identify vulnerabilities in your web applications and web services. NetSparker scanners employ a unique and dead-accurate vulnerability scanning engine that automatically verifies vulnerabilities with their proof of concept. For more information, visit them on the web at netsparker.com or email at contact@netsparker.com. Recorded Future. They help security teams make more confident decisions faster. Recorded Future's technology automates broad collection and analysis of cyber threat data and delivers the rich external context you need to understand alerts and emerging threats. With real-time threat intelligence from Recorded Future, security teams respond to threats 63% faster and find undetected threats 10 times quicker. To get started, go to recordedfuture.com/securityweekly and sign up for the Recorded Future Cyber Daily. Every day, you'll receive an email with the top results for trending technical indicators, cyber news, exploited vulnerabilities, suspicious IP addresses, and more. Subscribe today and stay ahead of cyber attacks. Endgame's converged endpoint security platform is transforming security programs, their people, processes, and technology with the most powerful endpoint protection and simplest user experience, ensuring analysts of any skill level can stop targeted attacks before information theft. Endgame unifies prevention, detection, and threat hunting to stop known and unknown attacker behaviors at scale with a single agent. For more information, visit endgame.com. Welcome back, everyone, to Paul's Security Weekly. I'm excited for this segment. Before we dive into it, we need your help in a survey that we're running for research purposes for an upcoming webcast. How mature is your process automation for your various security capabilities? Please visit securityweekly.com/5 stages of automation maturity. Wow, that's a mouthful. securityweekly.com/5 stages of automation maturity to submit your responses to our 5 stages even of automation maturity survey. Wow. We're going to be doing a webcast in November and share the results.
If you got me the new website, it would be easy. It would be under the survey tab. So we're almost there.
We're almost there. We're working on it as a team. Actually, quite a few of the team members here are working on that. I'm excited to introduce our guest, no stranger to the show, Corey Thuen. He's the something and co-founder. He's the co-founder. Is it just co-founder, Corey?
Yeah. That works.
Awesome. Corey, welcome back to Paul's Security Weekly.
Hey, yeah, good to see you guys again. Always awesome coming on the show.
So there's like topics and stuff, but basically, Corey and I were chatting, and I'm like, what you been working on? He's like, well, like we do this thing where it's really cool. We can take this unknown log sources or custom logs, and it's like we can parse them and do cool stuff with them. I'm like, oh, like you want some custom logs? I get some custom logs. Like we got an app, it's got logs. Like I could send it to you and it'd be really cool. He's like, cool, what's the app? I'm like, it's PPWorks. It's like, what the heck is that?
What's PPWorks?
Like it's an app we've been coding for quite I want to say it started right as we were moving into the space around 2015 time frame. It's one I spent the past 3 months and most of my time coding in. So I'm like, yeah, dude, I'll send you the logs. So Corey, you were one of the few to see my PPWorks logs, basically.
Yeah.
So many jokes.
So many jokes there.
Some things you can never unsee.
Right. So, Corey, does PP actually work?
Right. According to the logs, not all the time.
The PPWorks is there. We got the logs. I ingested all of your PPWorks logs. We've got them in there, so I'm forever changed as a person. But yeah, I thought it'd be a kind of a fun topic to dig into because I know Security Weekly is security, and we always talk about security stuff, but security is only one section of a company, right? So it's really common for practitioners out there, especially Blue Team, where you've got to deal with the logs coming out of some custom applications, and those logs can be sort of all over the place. So I thought it'd be kind of fun to talk about how that works and use some real world sort of open the kimono just a tiny bit when it comes to Security Weekly and what goes into making the PPWorks software happen so that everybody can enjoy the show that you guys...
It stands for Podcast Post-Production Works, and it's the software that we use to basically publish every single one of our segments and shows.
Yeah.
So
And we publish to multiple sources. I don't think people understand what happens when you.
There's a lot.
You guys. Some people think, you guys get to hang around all day, talking about security and doing podcasts. We do, but we got to get that content out there for you guys to view, right?
There's a business to run somewhere.
Right. There is a business to run. That's what I do. He plays with PP Works all day.
I just write the code to help the business run.
He plays with his PP Works.
But what we do is when a show gets produced, we do some audio and video editing, and then we bundle everything up, and we have to get it to multiple sources. We have to get it to YouTube so you guys can see it on our YouTube channel. We have to get it to Libsyn to get distributed to the podcast catchers. We have to get it to our website, which is WordPress, so that people can go out and see all that content, right? There's a lot of work that happens in there. And so what this software does is allows us to automate more and more of that publishing functionality for us, so
I'm
that
still scarred
you guys can get it.
I wrote an entire library to interface with the WordPress REST API, and I'm still
You're
scarred.
still reeling from that one.
I did, because it's not very well documented at all.
But it works.
Your REST API or the library?
WordPress's REST API. They do have someone did make a library, and it works for most things except for
images.
Now I want to release this open source because I wrote the image uploader basically from just using Python requests.
Nice.
And there was
Larry, you and I know the answer was both.
And so I will release that because I don't want anyone else to have to basically go through that headache of having to do that.
So eventually your PP will release?
Yes. Yes. The WordPress module.
But I mean, that's what we do as a business. We record this stuff. We've got to get
Publish
it
the
out
stuff.
to the community. We got to publish it, and the more automation we can do, the more fun we can have drinking and smoking cigars all day long. So just so the
why I
audience
get up at 5 a.m. most days and write code.
And sometimes that automation requires that you record some logs to see what is actually happening.
And that's what I sent to Corey.
Yep, exactly. So the business is what matters, and PP Works helps you to get that and accomplish the main mission. And so ideally, you'd want to be able to include the PP Works logs. It's going to be hard not to laugh every time we say that, but I'll try.
I named it that way just for that reason.
Yeah, I know. To include the PP Works logs alongside your security information, your business metrics, so you can be monitoring user download rates and that kind of thing, so you can improve that side of the business as well as security stuff. You want to know if you've got any potential problems like SQL injection with your or URL injections in your your WordPress site. That's obviously a concern too, and all those logs are sort of related, and so that's kind of what we're talking about when it comes to any of this. So
because my code never throws a Python exception. Never. Ever.
Yeah.
That I don't handle.
Yeah, we'll get into that, and I gotta say I'm gonna bring a couple real world examples, and again, like I do when I come on the show, these slides are mostly for my organization, not necessarily because PowerPoints. Otherwise, I'll be all over the place with tangents. So yeah, in like real world custom logs, because we do this for lots of different organizations. So PP Works isn't our first rodeo when it comes to helping people do this. You're gonna find all kinds of crazy stuff. PP Works was the first time, however, that I saw ASCII genitals. So that was a unique experience when it comes to custom logs. But so I had to add a bullet point to the things that you might find.
I thought it was appropriate, given the name and stuff. Anyway.
Yeah, I should have been prepared. But you find that. You find there's base64 in logs. You've got malformed JSON, XML, Ceph that doesn't follow the specs. You've got line breaks in the middle of entries. You've got legacy code that we were kind of talking about this before the show. Legacy code that does its own logging that developers inherit that they don't want to touch because it's scary or it just works, so we can't touch it. So we just have to kind of work around those logs sometimes, or we're worried about that. You get stack traces when there's exceptions, binary stuff, double encoding on things, like we've seen where developers will have logs where the URL encoding will be interpreted, but it doesn't get logged that way. It gets logged and encoded twice. So when you're looking at the logs, you got to be able to sort of pull that out and rip them apart and turn them around and analyze them dynamically, so you can you can get the picture about what it is that you're trying to do.
I mean, other than the ASCII genitals, none of that is my code. I'm just saying.
Well, you did send it to me, and I definitely pasted some in these slides. So you're wrong.
Sweet.
Here's an example. So entries are often not atomic. So basically, we're going to kind of go through a couple things that are a mess when it comes to logs, like a timestamp and then a bunch of hyphens. Like this is the kind of thing that you typically don't want in a log, and usually it's left over when a developer starts coding it locally, and then they're creating their log entries to be for them to look at the logs as a very human readable thing, right? We like these delimiters to help us figure out.
So Corey, yeah, that's exactly why I did that, right? Because there was all like probably hundreds of logging statements when I got the code, right? And so
printf,
I can go back and try and fix all that so it makes sense. Or what I did, and it's not the right thing to do, I admit that, but I'm like, okay, I need to know, like lots of logs happen when I edit stuff and add stuff, but when someone publishes something, I need to know the begin and end of the publishing and that's why I created that PP trail we talked about before, which I'm sure we're going to talk about again. Like I need to know when this certain action happens, what are the log entries that encompass that, and there's better ways to do this other than my lines after
it
dates.
looks pretty though. You can read it
when you're looking at to Corey's point, that's why I did it, because when a developer, I'm looking at the logs, I can go back and say, oh, we began publishing here, okay, what happened and where did it fail, right? But I need to know that starting point and end point. Yep.
So when you're at a small scale, this type of thing is better, because then you're a human, you're trying to read it, it helps you to move fast. But when you start centralizing your logs and you're putting this next to your Apache or whatever, you've got your proxy logs, like then things start to get jumbled, and then it just kind of gets in the way. And so one of the big things about us at Gravwell, where we disagree with most of the people in the industry, is we have a motto that is ingest everything and sort it out later. So this type of stuff, one of the reasons we made our tool is to help work around some of these things that maybe aren't super changeable necessarily, or are legacy or whatever. Right. And we'll dig into that in just a little bit. But like, if you have the ability to remove these type of things and create an atomic entry, that's generally better.
Corey, what do you mean by an atomic entry?
Yeah, so an atomic entry would be like, this is sort of a contrived example, because really we're talking about dashes and then a begin publishing. But an atomic entry would be, you don't want your event spread across multiple lines in your log files with different timestamps.
I gotcha. Yep.
And then having to shove that back together or mutilate it back in. Ideally, they should be like a single thing. So a user logged in would not be like the username contained in has initiated login, and then the next entry says a login with this ID has now resumed or finished, and then you got to kind of glue those together to get the final result. Ideally, you would have that all in a single entry, or multiple entries that include all of the context.
Right.
Which is sort of going into the next slide as well, and adding context to the entries.
To be curmudgeon-y for just a moment, you didn't actually define atomic. You defined what is not atomic. So for the uninformed layperson that's trying to keep up,
yeah, sure.
Atomic is the opposite of what you were describing?
Yes, an atomic entry is a single entry that contains the relevant pieces of information necessary to identify or learn from that event.
Yeah. Again, the better way would to be spit out some JSON when an event happens that uniquely identifies that event along with all the different fields and metadata, correct?
Right, and you want, yep, exactly. So if we kind of get into this one, because we see, like, here's an example of you spreading the stuff, or you or previous developer. I'm just going to keep picking on you. So this log is shit, Paul.
No, that is my code. Definitely where it says the tags are phishing, that is definitely my log entry.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah, see, so here's an example of we're saying the segment tag being applied is phishing, and then the tags are phishing. We could make this more atomic by and more contextual by including perhaps the episode number that this is applying to.
Yeah.
Right? Like you're creating a data model that you're applying these tags to, but the entry just says the tag is. Right. And that doesn't say shit.
And these were really not that I'm not defending this, because you're absolutely right, it could be way better, but I was kind of reverse engineering the WordPress API and trying to apply tags dynamically. So I was just sticking log statements in there to help me debug, like, okay, how am I building the tag structure, and then how am I sending it off to WordPress? The big change between XML RPC and WordPress REST API is that in the XML RPC API, you can just say the tag is fishing, and that's your ID. In the REST API, all tags and categories are referenced by an ID number. So, that completely changes how you implement all that stuff.
Right.
So I was trying to debug that, and those are my debug statements.
Hey,
Okay, go ahead.
One more quick question, if you can go back to your screen.
Sure.
I get the date and the timestamp. What are the 3 digits after the comma? If you can put your
those appear to be milliseconds. At least that's
I believe so. I'd have to look at my my app.logger or my logger.
Most of them are. It'll be like 19.768 instead of a comma, so that is a little unusual. But we've seen timestamp. You talk about
is that
formats.
Paul putting the comma in?
No, it's in Python. There's a module called logging, and in logging you define the format, and that was there wasn't much thought given to the format in this particular log. When I did the other one, I read all the documentation about what the format should be and looked at examples and set my own format based on the requirements. But like previous developers,
it's a timestamp. What threw me was the comma. Gotcha.
Correct. Yeah, and you can.
He thinks he's in Europe, and he uses the comma instead of the period.
Right.
So that's all. That's okay. He's thinking UK or something. That's okay.
No, I don't think so.
They defined the log format when they defined the logging object, and I didn't change it. I just left it, so I don't remember what it was set to. There's your answer.
Right. So I think it's important at this point to kind of take a step back and say, like, we're picking on Paul and these logs because that's what we have, and it's PP work, so it kind of deserves it.
Totally fine.
But this is real world stuff. So I think a lot of times security teams and developers, DevOps stuff can kind of butt heads a little bit because security looks at stuff and says, well, why can't you do this? But developers have all these other reasons for why they do stuff. Like you're talking about this library, you're talking about this code, this legacy stuff that you had to get in. You're talking about fighting WordPress and their stuff not working as documented necessarily. And that is what when you're dealing with these types of logs, you gotta try and put yourself in the other person's shoes a little bit and be able to deal with some of these weird, crazy things.
Given all those other things, atomic log entries are probably pretty low on a developer's priority list.
Yeah, a quick example, good documentation for an API like you find from Google or HubSpot shows you the full request and shows you the full response and then gives you code samples in Java and Python and JavaScript, right? WordPress give like basically none of that. They were like, this is like a request in curl, and there's a curl command to run that, and they didn't show me what the full request should be or the full response should be, hence logging statements.
This is not at all abnormal in any way. We see this at tons of places. So this is a super common thing. So when you're in your NOC and you're trying to do analysis for some of this stuff and trying to figure out, I've got a security thing, but let me go to the application logs and see if I can figure out what more about it, root cause. And you're running into logs like this, it's not necessarily the developer's fault. So it requires some communication there, and I think that's one of the main goals, at least for me personally. If people who are listening get nothing else except, hey, maybe our security team should talk with the devs and let's see if we can get our application logs in a spot that helps everybody out, then I'll say that this was a win, because that's sort of the goal. Because this happens tons of different places. And here's another entry where we talk about an entry in the log that doesn't have a relevant state. It makes it really tough to find something. So for context about what was being worked on, why this entry is in here, what is it actually doing? We ideally we'd like to know, what's the source component for this entry, even in the code. Which class is generating this log entry or something? What are the attributes that it's applied to? Is this going on, again, on a specific podcast that we're talking about here? What other contextual information can we provide? in order to make this log.
I'm curious if this is an example of what you were just talking about, where the developer contextually knows exactly what this is, but somebody else that might be.
Yeah, I mean,
so Paul, what is this?
It's either in the Libsyn API or the WordPress API, both of which suffer from, again, not great documentation.
Right.
So let me back up a second. When you go to Google and you work with one of their APIs, for the most part, they tell you like what the request and response should look like. They give you Google gives you like a little tester to say like you can plug your stuff in here and click submit and would like execute this API call. They also give you a list of the response codes. So they say there'll be this field, and when this field is populated, it means that in our case, right, like there's a duplicate file that was detected, or you've reached your quota, so you can then code to those certain things. Libsyn and WordPress don't have that level of documentation, so you end up with debug statements like what, and that's an incorrect debug statement. It's supposed to print out what the request was, but the type is wrong, so it doesn't print out the full request.
Yet another exception.
Yeah, and that could be, it could be an exception, absolutely.
And another log entry.
No, exactly. Well, but that's the point. Is
Right.
you don't know. That's why scripting is important. Dynamic analysis is super important. But those types of logs aren't necessarily structured. So
Right.
you're not gonna. The whole point is it's really tough to get like a sim or any sort of out of the box that can help you actually sort through and figure out what's actually happening. If you want to dig through some of these custom logs, you got to say now what are you're kind of stuck with grep or a couple other tools that are out there, and that's. One of the things that we're
depending on the API and depending on the specific function or method in that API, it might be doing a raw Python requests, or it might be calling a library that you install that's doing those Python requests, but front-ending that with an easier to use API. And your mileage could vary. You may have that library, but it doesn't support one piece of functionality, so your other function has to call Python request directly and basically implement the API in a raw request, or it's calling. So you end up with debug statements that are trying to print out what was my request, what was my response. So when you get an error, you can kind of compare them and go, how do I write my code? Because there's not much documentation, and that's why.
Yep, and so if you're going to do something atomic, keeping the request and the response together isn't necessarily a bad thing either. So you have the context in there. But I think we talked about this. So this is where we get into the PP trail.
Yeah.
About what you were talking about, because formatting your logs in JSON or
It's
like
great.
a key value pair is a great way to help do that, and that's basically required if you're going to use anything that's more of your sim style log analytics. That's going to try and parse that stuff. You're going to have to put it in this type of format.
To your point, Corey, about developers that end up in situations, right? I'm not going to go to my CEO, Mr. Matt Alderman, and go, hey, I need a week to rewrite all the logging so it spits out JSON. Matt's going to be like, yeah, no. We need to automatically send out tweets on stuff that we publish. And we also, from a security perspective, if there was like a fictitious security person, they'd be saying, you need a secrets manager, right? So you've got what really the last 3 months have taught me is you've got these competing priorities. But Corey, you're to your point, you're absolutely correct. JSON, as I've learned, and this is another testament to the situation you need to be aware of that developers get in, is sometimes you're learning as you go, right? Sometimes you're inheriting code or even writing from scratch, and you discover, you talk to people. Tyler was awesome to talk to at Black Hat, and other Python developer. I ask Joff questions every time he's on the show, and you learn as you go, and you're like, oh, the right way to do it is to, as Corey said, for logging.
You notice Joff
JSON.
hasn't been on the air lately.
Yeah, because he knew we were going to be talking about my incredible.
He's waiting until you publish the new website.
That's right. So JSON is a much better format because two advantages I noticed right away. One, it can be parsed back in the interface, awesome, like very easily. Second, there's a Python module that converts JSON to HTML. So when I had to do the notification, I make one call to an external library that takes my JSON log entry, converts it to HTML, and sends the email. And I'm like, this is how we should have done all of logging. But it's a week's worth of time to convert all the logging into JSON.
Wait, you do HTML formatted emails?
Yes.
What kind of barbarian are you?
Wow. And
Somebody has to be able to click on the link. Otherwise, I cannot serve up our malware. Oh, sorry.
No. Well, my whole thing is I could write the code to parse JSON into text and format it, or I can just make one call to this library and spit out HTML.
Yeah.
Gotta do that.
I'm just
Plus,
buzzing
you
your
gotta
HTML
remember
versus
that-
text email.
Right. But we're also trying to get our listeners and our guests information of here's your YouTube post, HTML link.
Sure.
Here's the tweet. Here's the LinkedIn. Here's the whatever. And that requires us to do it in HTML.
Yeah. So anyway,
I totally get the use case.
yeah. Corey,
totally
JSON
get it.
for the win, right?
Yeah, exactly. So JSON's great, but like you said, sometimes that you just don't have the time to go back and do stuff. So security still has to do their job, no matter what the logs end up looking like.
It's true.
And also, dumps happen. Sometimes you get dumps in your PP works, and this is an example. There's exceptions that show up from Python, and so you need to be able to handle those too, especially and like security events. I mean, the quintessential reason that security is a problem is because it doesn't align exactly with what the developer expected. And so it doesn't fit into the JSON paradigm always. And so then you might have a dump, either an exception or crazy log formats or something. And those are often the ones that you care the most about. So going in and being able to search through that is what's pretty key for being able to dig stuff. So just for funsies, I took and ingested the PPWorks logs and threw it in my local Docker. I just set up a quick Docker container for Gravwell, which if this is something that you wanted to do with your own stuff, we have Gravwell Community Edition, totally free, up to 2 gigs a day, runs in Docker. It's an apt install Gravwell, and you're already done. And then you can start throwing logs in. Super easy to get up and running, and you could
Nice.
Do this kind of thing with your own stuff if that's something you're playing with. But
So wait, Corey, I just want to go back. The point you made just a moment ago was very important. Specifically in this example with Python, when it throws an exception, it typically one of the more common causes is the application perhaps experienced a condition or data that it was not expecting, and when you process that in Python basically is throwing an error, going, my most common error, cannot concat or cannot compare stir to none type, right? Like that's pretty common Python error, especially if you're not used to the loosely typed, like you don't have to define your variables, in other words, in Python. And so that can be problematic. But that can be indicative of a user did something different, a user supplied something different, or an attacker caused some condition or provided me with some data, or the app some data that I was not expecting. So to me, exceptions are really useful for both improving the quality and resiliency of your code in the context of usability, resiliency and like not crashing or stopping execution, and security as well, because security really relates to those conditions. So Corey, you're spot on.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So and you look at the entries that I've got in here for your stuff, and I actually so I created like a little dashboard that just shows here's sort of I think this is probably the makings of the PP trail events that you're talking about. You have some malformed JSON in here, so
I do.
Just so you know.
Yeah, I had to construct that JSON based off strings, list of strings, and lists that contained dictionaries of JSON. And I wasn't very good at parsing all of that.
Exactly.
That was my
that's a lot of
first
stuff,
pass.
right?
That was my first pass.
This is the kind of thing like, we want to set up a dashboard here that shows everybody, when your episodes get published, you want confirmation that they went out to each of the different hosts.
Correct.
And where they went out and what the end result was. And so if this was actually not malformed JSON, then we could parse out the individual pieces and put that in a nice chart. But since right now it kind of doesn't do that, then another example of things don't always match up with expectations. But it's important to be able to work through that as you go, which is cool.
Well, Corey, I want to run this by you. So that was my first pass at trying to normalize and JSONify the logging, right? And I created basically 3 different kind of fields in my messages. First was the label of what function it was executing. So was I trying to publish to YouTube? Was I trying to publish to Libsyn? Was I trying to publish to WordPress, right? So it says this is where I was publishing. And then in the dictionary, it starts off as a dictionary, right? There's a status and an error. And status could be like success. Like I did this, it was successful. Here's the link to your WordPress post. That's the best type of status, right? But status can also be like, I encountered this. It wasn't necessarily an error. Like basically the file already existed, or, you know, like I retried once and it failed, and then I retried another time and it was success. So I keep that in the status field. Errors are solely reserved for Python exceptions. Like I was doing this and I got a Python exception for whatever reason. So those are errors. So I was trying to basically normalize all of those activities into a dictionary that I convert to JSON. And
so what I'm hearing here is sometimes during an encounter, your PP has a dict and something about a Python.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And occasionally it spooges and throws an exception. Yep.
Yeah, sometimes. Yeah, actually. So if I search for exception, it looks like here your PP works just splooged everywhere, and we get this giant entry about your Python exception, right? And so
giant
if I'm
entry
security, this is the kind of thing that I care about, because exactly like you said. So this is in an internal log. I only have these. You know, I don't have your network traffic information or anything like that. But if this was an internet-facing application, you're absolutely certain that I, as a blue teamer, would definitely want to correlate this with my NetFlow, firewall rules,
right?
IDS, IPS stuff to try and figure out what caused this exception. Is this attacker-oriented? Is this just a bug in the code? Maybe bring in developers as part of that investigation. But that's all part of the threat hunting. And exceptions are definitely an important tip that you might use when you're generating hypothesis for doing that threat hunting and looking through stuff. So it's really important that you're not dropping.
And only the tip.
Sometimes.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I've been sitting here wondering, because my orientation is much more towards system logs and event logs, security logs. And I'm sitting here wondering and wanted to ask, what exactly is generating these particular types of logs? And if I'm understanding correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, these particular logs that you have been reviewing this episode are things that Paul kind of wrote on the fly to generate logs so he could figure out what the code is doing. Is that
these particular ones? But as an example, we have another customer, and they have internal application logs that measures some key performance metrics about their infrastructure, how many customers they're able to service at a time, what the load on some of the servers are, but you can't just use straight up CPU for some of that stuff because they're in different areas. So they're wanting to monitor that aspect and how they're serving customers. Sorry for being a little vague. I don't want to.
Well, that's okay. I guess, but there's a second category, I guess, that is what you're describing that I see a lot of, or it's fairly common, which I would just call performance performance metrics or network health type of checks.
Yep.
But these specific logs are logs that Paul had been writing to try to get the website to work, essentially.
Yeah, and so to Corey's point, right, is when you look at log sources, you're looking at performance metrics around how is your infrastructure performing, CPU, memory, disk, maybe network traffic, et cetera, et cetera. You're also collecting logs about how the application's performing, when it throws exceptions, and then you want to correlate a lot of that information, because when an exception gets thrown in an application, maybe it's because my disk is full, or it's because somebody is throwing malformed packets or an attack at the application and is throwing an exception, right? So to Corey's point is, in order to be able to correlate those activities, if you're collecting the logs in a standard format, now I can start to correlate to say, oh, that was a performance issue because I've got all these performance logs over here on this side that say, look, I'm out of disk space. I tried to do something. I threw an exception. That is okay. That's an operational function, right, issue. Versus a security issue where somebody's actually trying to come into your application, do something malicious, throw in an exception, and now I can go trace back on the other side to say, okay, what initiated that potential attack? Yeah.
Exactly. As a concrete example, we have a customer who was monitoring usage of their API, and a couple exceptions had happened around the time when an adversary, I guess we'll say an adversary, was actually a customer of theirs, but customers can be adversarial. So you got to worry about that, was working out how to get around rate limits to the API so that they could basically essentially steal services at a higher tier than what they were paying for. Because they had found a way around the rate limits to some of that stuff. And so exceptions were the way in to figure out that that was even happening in the first place.
And like I get that. I mean, first off, that is unethical in that particular situation that you described. I would deem that as unethical. However, APIs do have quotas. And as a developer now, like, quotas are super freaking frustrating, man. Like, what the F?
He codes around them.
And that's exactly the scenario we do. Like, I code it, not because, like, if I could pay money to have 1 million points in YouTube's quota, like, where do I write, within reason, if it's in the budget.
Right, where do I write the check?
Well, where do I write the check, right? Like, if it's $30 a month or whatever, and that buys me 1 million points, friggin' great. That saves us so many cycles in development, worth $30, $50 a month, right, to pay for that.
You hear this, YouTube? There's a market.
There's a market for that. I would
Has been for a while.
I would absolutely pay for that because it's, again, super frustrating, especially when speaking about quotas, right? When you put your code into a CI/CD pipeline and you want to do automated testing, you fill up quotas really fast. Like, okay, go wipe the database clean, start from scratch, and now go publish every show to every destination 3 times in the 3 different ways that we can publish all the different scenarios.
I need an update, a delete, a replace, or whatever.
And every action, in YouTube's and other APIs work similarly. Every action or every request, right, that you make of the API accumulates points. So, for example, in YouTube, uploading a video is 1,600 points. Deleting a video is 50 points. Updating the tags and description is some other points. They actually have a points calculator, on their website. And so you can rack up points. So like in our case, default you get 10,000 points in YouTube's API. Well, that's only like maybe 8 or 9 videos a day. And if I'm multiple releases a day and my test cycle is 10, I got to publish 10 times to go through a full test cycle. I can't even go through 1 test cycle in a day. Super annoying. Sorry, I was on my soapbox there for a minute. I'm off now.
Wow. Wow. So
oh, wait, Corey, I think you're muted.
Paul, your PP releases 7 or 8 times a day?
It does.
Wow.
It's a lot of releasing.
It really does work.
A lot of logs.
He's not to Instagram yet at doing it every 7 minutes, but
wow. Not yet.
I mean, that stamina, dude.
Is that what they've documented?
7 minutes. Every 7 minutes they do a release.
Wow.
Wow.
Yeah.
Continuous integration, yeah.
Clearly,
for that.
Yeah, clearly they're not going to EdgeCon.
Nope. Sorry, Corey, you were saying something earlier?
I was just gonna say that's an important piece. And so I just got a couple PP Works tips for you or anybody who's doing such things. When you're doing your logging, you want to try and define goals where you can. And so, like you said, it sounds like you're sort of on track with the PP trail. You want to know how the publishing goes, what the results of that was, if you ran into any errors, etc. And so that might be your main goal of how you're going to develop and create the log format for what you're doing. So this is unique to every organization. And so this is important to have communication between your DevOps team and your security team to make sure that both teams are benefiting from the logs on this. And they can agree on stuff. But you don't always know what you don't know when it comes to logs. So be flexible is the name of the game. Use flexible tools that aren't super rigid and keeping you to specific stuff. You want to add context to your entries so that when you're looking at a log, you can get a better idea about what causes it or what's around it.
Corey, it's another question I have for you because I noticed this exact thing just from experience, right, of like working with the code. I'm reading that log entry and I'm like, wait, where in the code did that happen? And was it an error or was it like something that was normal? So I started my own formatting and then the more I researched and read, I realized there's better ways to do this.
Which is why you have malformed JSON and incompatible Ceph.
Exactly. But so I started my own format of every log entry will begin with status, and that's just like a message that like nothing's bad happened, just saying what happened, right? I've got error, which is I encountered some error somewhere, and then I've got debug, which is like I'm trying to make stuff work, so I'm going to print out like a lot more than I normally do. Ideally, that's controlled with your logging object and other flags that, like, I only want to print debug in development, not in staging or production. Maybe I do want to do it in staging, but definitely not in production.
Right.
And then I started logging which module and method and or function was writing that log. So I knew that, pub tweet is the method in segments, right, that publishes the tweet. So when it logs, it's status pub tweet. But there's ways to, in different languages, I believe, to automatically document this stuff in your logs, and smarter ways to do that other than the developer remembering, like, I got to manually type in status and the method name.
Oh, there kind of are, and there's standards you can follow, but that's pretty rare. Most of the time, it's exactly like you described, where it comes up more organically, or like the JSON structure of a log will be created organically. But creating like the log level, like you said, status, debug, error, adding in keywords for the components is another key thing. So you know where in the code to look if you're trying to figure something out. But additional stuff like in this example where you're saying starting conversion from HD to MP3. What's the file name? Which episode is it? What are the tags associated with it? Which infrastructure is performing this activity? How big is the file? Sort of all these things can help if you run into errors to figure out what's going on.
And you can probably, a smarter way to do that would be to define attributes in your classes that you would basically read from and print every time you logged, right? That would ease the, okay. I can't believe I spent 3 months before I figured that out. Damn it.
Jeff wants to put his hand on your PP.
I have a couple questions. And again, because I'm an old timer. Back when I used to code, occasionally the code that I wrote in required compiling. And my first question is this just how it works these days when you don't compile code anymore? You have to set up some sort of debugging routine and you just kind of limp along?
Well, Corey, if I could just take the first pass at this one. So Python being interpreted and not strongly typed. Did I say that right, Corey? Not strongly typed. In other words, I don't have to define my variables before I use them.
Right.
I don't benefit.
It's duck typed,
Yeah, I don't benefit, Jeff, from those compile time errors. In other words, if I reference a variable before assignment, in Python, I see that at runtime. In C or Java, I believe, or Go, right, I would get an error at compile time, and my code wouldn't compile, and I'd go as a developer and fix that.
Which was not necessarily less painful than what you're describing, but at least you had a starting point. It would crap out somewhere, and you're like, okay, something went wrong here, or
now the second part of the answer to that question, Jeff, for me and other people who are way better at this than I, please weigh in. But what I've done is in my IDE, I flipped some of my linting to be like warnings or like weak warnings into true errors. So if a variable could be referenced before assignment, in my IDE, that's an error. And that shows up as like red, and I can filter for that when I do the inspection of my code. Like, those are all errors. And I think that's the transition when you're, as a pen tester, those can attest to. You write a quick Python script. Like, not having that strongly typed thing is an advantage. I can write code faster. I don't have to do as much debugging. And that's great. When I'm in 5,000 plus lines of code, multiple developers, in a web application that's taking input from multiple users and executing multiple functions, that's a disadvantage of Python, in my opinion. And I think that a good way to solve that is to go into your IDE, your linting tool, and be like, no, you can't do that. Like, you got to define your variables, because someone else could be writing a completely different piece of code and referencing things, and users could be entering things wrong or right or anywhere in between, and you have to account for that.
Yeah,
did I get that kind of sort of right?
Yeah. I think it's almost more important when you're not talking about the dynamic languages, because then you're talking about that's the classic buffer overflow is you're core dumping because you're accessing memory that you don't have access to. So your precompiled thing still has those problems. You still have to do this kind of anomaly log detection and grabbing all that stuff.
Right.
But it just happens at a different time. So.
Paul was kind of touching on what was going to be my second question, which is probably a little bit more philosophical. Is like, is this better than the old way? Because it sounds in some ways it's more painful. And a third question, I guess I would ask in terms of Python, just because you don't have to define a variable, does that mean you shouldn't?
So I like to define my variables more often than not, especially when you have code that's running based on external user input, right? So a lot of times, again, as a pen tester, you write a script like, yeah, you're the only user, and if it throws an exception and like crashes, you're like, oh, I got to give it the right data, and that's cool. But like when you're writing stuff that other people are using, it's a different story. I do like to define those. Also, Python has evolved through the versions. One of the big projects that we have to make time for is converting from 2.7 to 3. Oh. And 3.5 introduced, at least in functions, they introduced the ability to say that function parameters, you can define the type when you're passing it to the function. Now, it's not perfect, but there's Python's kind of catching on to, we need to be, at least give the user some ability to make it a little more strongly typed. And that's not till 3.5. I'd love to do that on my functions today. However, again, it's a couple of weeks, probably more than a week-long project that I have to go to Matt and say,
I already had to wait 3 months. Damn it.
That's right. To get publishing working. Now I'm like, It's at least 2 to 3 more weeks, solid programming time myself and someone else to take this from 2.7 to 3 in regression test and convert all the code.
To Jeff, to your point, is there are advantages and disadvantages for interpreted languages and compiled languages. And everybody is going to make that choice, right? Python, PHP, interpreted languages are used a lot because they're easy to develop against, but they create all these kind of cons when it comes to debugging and other things. Compiled code gives you some structure, but then it's all through the compilation side. Sometimes there are harder languages to learn. You've seen evolutions with Go, for example, that I think a lot of people are starting to adopt to.
Yep, right.
But people have picked languages that they're running on. And it's not easy to take a PHP app and convert it, or a Python app and convert it to a Go or a C or a whatever, right? So once you've kind of laid that foundation, you just have to understand how to work through it.
Now, I would say that Python gives you the facility with exception handling that I think is pretty amazing in Python above and beyond some of the other languages. Exception handling in Python is really powerful, and if you have to spend the time to implement it properly, but I think if you do, it can help you overcome some of those issues where like you don't have to define variables and things like that. If you use exception handling properly, it can be very effective in handling what it says, right? Handling those exceptions. But learning how to do that for me, and Corey and others, I don't know if you've done other languages and Python and gone through different languages. Exception handling in Python for me was really different than any other language I had ever done anyway.
Well, they're all interesting. We haven't even talked about the most memeable language of all, JavaScript.
Right?
I don't get into any of that.
I try and stay away, to be honest.
Hey, man, I'm weird in the security community. JavaScript is actually my favorite language. I love it. I like the functional and the prototypal inheritance stuff. It's all really cool. But yeah, the duck typing is something that bites people all the time.
And so hold on, JavaScript's the same way as Python. Like you don't have to define a variable before you
right. TypeScript is a thing on top of that. So now most frameworks are using TypeScript for that exact same reason. Like Python 3.5, like you define what the type is. So when you call a function,
but now
if the type doesn't match.
Corey, in JavaScript, do you have exception? What does your exception handling look like? Because I haven't done that much.
Same. Yeah, try catch blocks.
Okay, gotcha.
And Corey, now my question will be JavaScript client side or server side?
Client side.
All JavaScript everywhere. When my PP works, I'll put JavaScript right in there.
Well, we used to do a lot of JavaScript on the client side to render the pages and all that other stuff, and so why not push it to the client? It takes a load off the server side, right?
Now Node.js is a thing, so like,
it is.
Right.
And I will say, Corey, I think your application Gravwell is Angular, right?
Yep. Yeah. So all our client is the GUI that I was showing is all Angular, which is TypeScript on JavaScript, and then the backend is Go.
Right.
For our tech stack.
Yeah. So for us, Jack, our developer, one of our developers, is implementing a React interface, which is, I mean, essentially you need the same components, right? It's all written in JavaScript kind of thing. So I will transition to that because I'm going to have to know how to, learn it and
better than
support it.
jQuery.
It is way better than jQuery. I'm doing that today, and
all right, I feel like we're talking about religion now. I don't know about
No.
like jQuery gets the job done and very basic, and I don't try and force it to do it's basic. I tell the guys, I'm like, this is what you get now. Anything beyond this, you gotta wait for the React interface because I'm not going through the pain of making this any better or more
React
advanced.
is awesome, I gotta say.
Yeah.
It is really cool. It's a really awesome programming paradigm. I like it a lot. But
continue, Corey.
we should probably wrap it up. So here's my parting words, if I could say, is you want to make sure you keep your anomalies and analyze them. Security teams work with your dev teams. Keep your crash dumps, your error messages. They're often unstructured, often weird. Your PP works is going to splooge all over the logs, and that's an important thing to be able to deal with. And so you want to get those logs in a place where you can cross-reference them with your other logging information to really get the full context about what it was that caused this issue. How do we go forward? Is this some security thing that we need to investigate? And beyond there. So
Corey, can I sum this up? Look, keep your logs atomic, right? Use JSON.
Yep.
Because then if I have atomic JSON-based logs, then the ability to correlate to other events in your SIM with other log events is probably a little easier, right?
Right. If you have a field that says source IP was this, then you can coordinate it with your NetFlow or whatever. It makes it easier.
But that's a fantastic thing, security people, if you're listening, right, to have that conversation with your developers now, right? Wish I had understood it to this level as we discussed today. As we
keep your logs atomic, give it to them in JSON, give them enough context. And then that'll make it easier for them to correlate with all the other logs they're collecting to actually look for whether it's an operational issue, a security issue,
But I think it's an architecture thing, and I take full responsibility. I was the architect of this software from day one. I set forth the requirements.
I'm taking over the architecture role.
The functionality, right? But I didn't put forth any requirements on what was logged. And that what I'm hearing now is that's super important, right? You need to, as the architect or security person, whether you're talking to the architect or the developers or both, is set forth those parameters to say, look, when you log something, you have to fit into this other entire ecosystem to allow us to correlate events. And that's one of the pieces that was missing in the architecture.
Right.
Yep.
So that's the ideal, but the reality is, the reality is we're all people and stuff happens. So
we write stuff to logs to debug
you
stuff.
really got to be able to stick and move with the logs. You got to be able to dynamically analyze them, grepping and extracting values and throwing them on charts, and kind of like I did with the dashboard of your guys' stuff. Like, you want to be able to dig through and set up and get context, even if the logs suck, because the reality is they're going to suck. Some of them will at some point. If you can work with the DevOps team to help improve them, then that's an awesome goal. But like you said, Paul, like that's a tough thing to get budget and resources for, because it doesn't necessarily drive the needle in a way that helps the C-suite to really see that. That's a historically difficult thing to convince them of.
Right, because we want to move function and features out on a timely basis to hit our audience, in our case, but for a consumer or whatever the business model is, right? We're on the business side, we're thinking about get that functionality out, get that capability out, get it out there, start using it. We don't think about the logs. We don't think about the security and operational impacts of how those logs are coming out and how we have to correlate them in with all the other stuff that's being collected. But it's a good conversation to have. And I've been a big proponent of security talking to dev teams for a long time. As we see this transformation happen, just having the conversation will help us start to get better data for the security guys to do their job, but also keep the developers doing their job, which is getting feature functionality out to the customer base.
Yep, exactly. And I would say, as one last thing, like you can lean on your vendors and third-party security assessment people as well a little bit to help you with the C-suite side of it. So if you really do think you need a little help or you want to work on this justification that says, if we could just take 3 days and rework this logging setup, then we would have a much better idea about the usage of our system and be much, we're going to save time responding to incidents, as an example. Then that's putting it in the language that C-suite can understand. That usually, when you're in the trenches, you don't necessarily think about stuff like that.
Right.
And so
but
that
also
part's important too.
There's an operational benefit to doing this as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Speaking of logs.
I mean, look, logs of impact security and operations almost equally. Operations have to know how the infrastructure is performing to get better performing systems out there.
Better user experience. When
better
I did that,
user experience.
The PP trail that we alluded to is JSON, a poorly formatted JSON log at this point, but it's the beginnings of now I format that in an HTML email to the people who are publishing.
Right.
And Mark's like, oh, that's so great. Like I get an email. It tells me exactly what happened in an email, and I can go back and fix something and or know that, like, hey, it published without errors. And when there's an error, I know what the error was. That was a huge problem in our application from a user perspective.
We didn't know where it was. Yeah, we didn't know what was happening.
And from a security perspective, if I don't know what the error condition was, that's bad because attackers can slip through and do stuff without you noticing. It's also bad from a troubleshooting perspective because now your users and your developers and your ops team are spending more time trying to debug, like, what was the problem? Why didn't it publish? Why did it crash? Why didn't it deploy? Well, I don't know, because the logging is, like, all over the place.
Right.
So, or non-existent.
Yep.
That's a great point. So, Corey, just to kind of summarize, like, were you able to make sense of the logs using Gravwell, or do we need to implement some of the recommendations to make that a reality, or did you get some kind of value? Do we get some value implementing Gravwell, even if the logs are somewhat poorly formatted?
No, I think even the logs as is, that's one of the nice parts about our tool to pat ourselves on the back. The team did a good job for that was our goal when we wrote line 0 of the code, was we wanted to be able to deal with logs like this because that's the reality of the situation. So in that brief dashboard that I pulled up, I built that in 20 minutes or so of digging through and saying, like, okay, we can identify when publishing happens, we can identify when errors happen. And so if I was for realsies setting this up in your guys' setup, I would want to probably put some automation around that with some alerting or emails, and then correlating that with some of your other data that you're getting out of your metrics for your users and download and view counts and stuff to create the holistic picture of what it looks like from episode creation to publication. And I don't know, there's just lots of, like, those are the typical things that we work with for customers who are looking to get insights out of their custom logs on top of more standard stuff.
Awesome. Very good. Corey, thank you very much for appearing on Paul's Security Weekly yet again.
Thanks for having me. Good to see everybody.
securityweekly.com/Gravwell, right? Or gravwell.io. Go get the free trial. And again, Corey, thanks so much for coming on the show tonight. And said that just for you, Larry. And coming up next, Chris Hadnagy. Stay tuned for an awesome interview with Chris.